is to be asked to participate in this. If I could have a tear in one eye and a smile in the other, that's exactly where I would be right now. But I better not start crying. We've gathered here today to honor God by honoring one of His unique creations, one of His own children, and to give thanks in our heart of hearts that we've had a chance to share a piece of time and space with Marian. How do you really take the measure of another person's life? We take snapshots. We have etchings. We have our own experiences with one another that point us to the value and impact a person like Marian can leave on us. Some of us here today have known her for a few years later in life as she lived through physical challenges that frankly would have stunted a lesser spirit. Others, like her children and family, have a much longer view and a deeper knowing. In speaking with John yesterday morning about his mother, we commented that there were sort of two rather distinct experiences one might have of Marian that are really complementary. It can be partially summed up by a saying that we use in this part of the world. I like to say Marian was an iron fist and a velvet glove. What I mean by that is that with her there was a gentleness of spirit, a playful aspect to her personality that was matched up with what we call an indomitable spirit. For 30 years I taught Taekwondo and Hapkido, and there's a saying called Pilsung in Korean. It means the spirit that refuses to give up. And in many ways, that was Marian. This is a woman who was a joy to be around. And at the same time, you knew you were engaging a hidden strength that seemed rooted in her whole view of life and faith. After her speech was effected, she came through a time of remarkably difficult struggle and frustration that required that tenacious character. And yet, just beneath the surface, if you looked in her eyes, you always knew there was mischief waiting to come out, lurking to emerge, and a joy that went with it. I used to ask her after worship or when I would see her in the hallway, usually daily, how she was doing, and she would tell me if it was so-so or not. And then I would ask her if she was behaving, and she would get this odd little twinkle in her eye, and she would mutter, "Oh no." Her eyes smiled. All of our memories today are now bracketed and brought forth to reflect the expanse of her character. And yet, you know, all of those fun, humorous models, along with the struggles, don't give us the full meaning of her life. They give us snapshots, especially now that death has come into our midst. We have to see her in one other way, in one other light, and in light of another relationship, as a child of the one who now owns her. And that marked her life completely and fully. Even now, St. Paul writes, "My life is being poured out as a libation. The time of my departure is at hand." This isn't language you and I are very likely to use on a daily basis, is it? We understand the sports analogies that he uses after this: running a race in a stadium, fighting in an arena, completing a competition. But what do you make of those opening lines? "Even now I pour my life out as a libation." If you translate it quite literally from Greek, what Paul is inviting us to see is a self-portrait. As we move through this life and take a moment from time to time to look at ourselves, to view how we paint our own images. What is a libation? It's not merely a drink or refreshment. It's not a cold one after a hard day's work. A libation was a thank offering, offered up to God. It was a sacrifice. The picture that Paul is painting is of a life that isn't its own, but a life given over to someone else out of gratitude. And gratitude has a way of weaving a fabric into our souls. And it comes out in everything that we do. Paul's verbal artwork points to the life of the one that he had served and in whom he placed his trust and knew in the end that he finally belonged to, and that was Christ. He poured himself out as an offering, and I can't help but think of Marian in the same way. Christ became for Paul a sign of how deep God's love for all creation is. And nothing made that more clear than Jesus' own willingness to give himself completely for everybody he ever encountered, a libation. Perhaps that's the deeper context for Marian and for us today. We mean so much to God that he has given us an embodied sign of that in Jesus Christ, so that in him we see the real value we have. We see the real picture that God paints of us. We are not defined eternally in this life by our failures or our partial accomplishments, by health or by strokes, by virtues or by our missteps. We are defined in this life by love, by the love God has for all creation, by God's acting to give us all we need to know that we matter to him above all things, whether alive in this world or whether having crossed into the next. In the monastery of Our Lady of Gethsemane in Bardstown, Kentucky, there is a small cemetery adjacent to that great church. When I was a boy, my father took me there on retreats, and I got to hear Thomas Merton, who's perhaps the greatest spiritual author of the 20th century. He died very suddenly and is buried there in a simple grave. But what is striking is that the graves are used over and over again. I visited Father Lewis, as he was known, to see where his grave was, and one of the other brothers there came up and spoke to me about a practice in that monastery. After one grave has been untouched for a long period, it becomes the resting place of another brother who dies later. But beforehand, the new monk who is buried has his head laid on the shoulder bones of the monk who was resting there before him. An eternal link, a connection. Each one of these men literally becomes signs of life given over for others. They become signs of Christ giving himself for the life of the world. Marian often gave herself for her family, and she gave herself for this community, not in ways that were immediately apparent, but by the very spirit that she brought into this place. Loved of the staff and of everyone that knew her. That's a gift. What makes today worthy of our gathering, both to honor her, is that God has poured out for us in his Son a love that's even greater, that even death cannot conquer. And while we are grateful for Marian and what she gave us, we are also even more deeply grateful that our hope in Marian's rest today is in the love of God. Amen. Brothers and sisters, trusting and living in God, let us confess our faith. I believe in God the Father,